wanted to share, saying extreme shortness is that the more my years go by here in South Africa, the more I'm sorry I didn't get to meet Franz Auerbach, and I wonder what would he have to say about the challenges and predicaments of our times. And I find his idea of no single loyalty very valuable to our confused and distracted society. I find his devotion to education, for example, his decades of dedication to the African night schools, to be an important role model for us, and I find his ongoing commitment to raise a voice against injustice in the wider circles as well as within your own community an example worthy to follow, and his memory is indeed a blessing among us.
And I had some things to say about Franz, what he said about himself, that applies to his humanism and his attitude to the Jewish approach to perhaps violence that's inherent in us. And after that very poignant and difficult lesson, I suppose, it may be appropriate, so if you indulge me, it's not long. Bonita's is much longer. Auerbach had a strong sense of Jewish history and spoke of the importance of Jewish understanding of what it means to be truly human. He wrote, "Jewish scripture sets for us a high goal for human beings. It holds out the possibility of human improvement, and quite frankly, I feel that we place too much emphasis on the sinfulness of mankind. It is sometimes taught that human beings are naturally aggressive, and that little can be done to change human nature. Judaism does not believe that human beings are born sinful. In spite of our weaknesses, we are assured each year during the Day of Atonement that God's judgment will be tempered by forgiveness and benevolence through prayer, repentance, and the practice of justice through charitable deeds. I believe that humanity can make greater progress towards peace and harmony. It means that being part of a minority community that has often protected its identity by isolating itself from the larger community. There are signs, however, of the Jewish community being prepared to grow towards broader human understanding and community. Jews will always be Jews, but will hopefully be prepared to share in and shape the future in a more creative manner. This fact, he reminds us, is wonderfully expressed in the tradition of African humanism. A person is a person through other persons." Now comes the difficult part, because I've been told to shorten it. I plagiarized a lot of this from a King David thing that was in Google, which was the most affectionate. There are many others that I could have chosen, but to anyone who'd like to go through it, Bonita's asked me to try and shorten it, and I think I will try. There's so many important facets. She's a force of nature, and they're difficult to describe. Here we go. She's a human rights lawyer, an activist, an academic. She's the director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies and associate professor of law at the School of Law at Beit University. She matriculated at King David High School, represented the school at an international debating thing when she was at Stellenbosch, had studied drama, law and English at the university. She graduated in the Dean's Honour List and represented Stellenbosch at the World's Debating Championship at Princeton University. Bonita then obtained her LLB cum laude from Wits and her master's and doctorate in law from Yale Law School in the United States. Bonita then worked in London as a human rights advisor in the House of Lords. Upon returning to South Africa in 2010, Bonita became an associate professor at Wits Law School. In 2013, she became the director of Applied Legal Studies, a long-standing civil society organization and research entity specializing in human rights law and justice. Bonita also teaches international law, business and human rights, and international criminal law at the university. She's the author of a book, domestic violence and international law. She was the internal investigator in the sexual harassment inquiry at Wits in 2013 and is the chair of the Sexual Harassment Advisory Committee at Wits. She is an editor and chair of the board of the South African Journal of Human Rights and a founding member of the board of Lawyers Against Abuse. Bonita was also accepted for the African Leadership Initiative, part of the Aspen Institute, and was awarded the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Fellowship. In the typical fashion in this thing, and I suppose, is that Bonita recognizes the value of her teachers. And she noted two teachers, Mrs. Price and a Mrs. Seftel, who installed in her commitment to family and students and ensured that apartheid did not enter the classroom. Her association with Lord Joel Joffe and her grandmother on matters of humanity and social justice are part of where she comes from. But most importantly, I think the most important part of her is that she's such a grounded sense of herself. And I think that's where most of the strength seems to come from. Earlier this year, she was appointed a Knight of the National Order of Merit of France for her work addressing gender-based violence. This is in recognition of her 20 years of work against gender-based violence in South Africa. She told me today that her interest in human rights crystallized when on an early trip to the US, she was asked by a US immigration officer who questioned her as to why she was interested in human rights. Her reply was immediate, because her grandmother was a Holocaust survivor and she lives in South Africa. She is, by conviction and action, enraged by injustice. Her driven operational thesis is that we are unlikely to change people, but we can change systems. A different approach to France's, and I'm sure will be the theme, or carried in the theme of her talk tonight. She is unequivocal as to her most significant achievement. Her daughter, her husband, who she describes as her foundation, and her family past and present. It gives me great pleasure to invite you to deliver the words.
There's a moment where you don't actually recognize yourself. And those words were extremely heartwarming, and I just really appreciate what else you found worthwhile talking about. And I'm indebted. I'm really indebted to be here, and grateful to be here, and to be part of this prestigious occasion, which is both daunting, but also profoundly exciting. Now, I'm afraid that the topic is going to be depressing. If you didn't know that walking into a talk about violence and social justice, then spoiler alert, it's not going to be a bag of laughs. But I think it's an important discussion to have nonetheless. And I really urge you, as I talk about my views on violence and social justice, to know that I've been at the coalface of so much of this for 20 years, and I urge you to never for a moment think that we cannot be successful in the obliteration of violence, in the obliteration of impunity in the face of violence. So let's, for the next 30 or 40 minutes, be miserable, but thereafter, please remain aspirational, hopeful, and committed to the termination of impunity. Right, so I want to start by reinforcing how most of us think of violence. I think most of us think of violence as something rooted in a moment of time and a moment of visual physicality, right? You think about a boxing match where the fist is thrust against the jaw of one's opponent. You think about a knife that is used to pierce a human body, or a bullet that is shot into the flesh of the victim. These are very visual conceptions of violence that happen within a moment. There's a beginning and an end. Would you agree? This is what I call physical and visible violence. But even perhaps more sinister than that violence is something I call invisible violence. Invisible violence has no contained time and often extends along a continuum of time, sometimes beyond generations. And we very rarely see it. There's not a particular weapon that may be used. There's not a particular physical manifestation in that moment of the violence, but it is nonetheless violence. It's amorphous, and it is, have no doubt, the key cause of the very public violence to which we all related and to which we all understand. And I'm going to try and explain this hypothesis of invisible violence through 3 stories. The first story is about a man named Johannes. And Johannes hailed from the Eastern Cape. And like his father before him and his grandfather before him, he went from the Eastern Cape at the age of 15 to work in the mines in West Rand, in the Northwest Rand. And for 15 years, he worked in the mines. And after 15 years, he began to get ill. And he found it difficult to breathe. And he started to really battle to work. He realized that he wasn't going to be able to continue on that basis. He wasn't going to be able to continue to work in that way, so he approached the medical facility at the mine. And the doctor employed by the mine at the medical facility came to the determination that the illness was not caused by his occupation, and therefore he was discharged with no compensation. He went back after 15 years with no money. Why is that? Because the money and the salary he received was distributed and sent back home to assist the 10, 15 people dependent on that salary, children, elderly. And, not sure if you know this, but there are hardly any shops in mining-affected communities. Has anyone ever been in a mining-affected community or lived there? Okay, am I right? No. There are lots of shops. The reality, we can have a discussion about that afterwards. The price of bread in the mining communities is much higher than in other areas. And the result is that there's increasing levels of indigency, debt, loan sharks, and a cycle of poverty. Johannes goes home where he is taken care of by his wife, and his son works in Johannesburg as a gardener, and the son knows that they have the best treatment at Baragwana Hospital. So he saves up enough money to bring his father, Johannes, to Baragwana. He makes the trip by taxi, by bus, from the Eastern Cape through to Johannesburg and arrives at 5 o'clock in the morning at the doors of Baragwana Hospital. He waits in the blistering heat until eventually he is seen. And the doctor says to him, yes, you are suffering from a respiratory illness. And that respiratory illness demands a certain type of addressing. And we have state-of-the-art equipment in this hospital that can help and cure what you want. Problem is, it's not working. And it hasn't been working for several weeks. But come back in 3 months' time, we should be fine by then. Johannes goes home. 2 weeks later, he dies. And he dies of a death that was curable. He dies of a death caused by nothing other than the failure of a medical intervention. His son, meanwhile, has spent all his savings on bringing his father to Baragwana and has no money to go to the funeral. So he goes to his employers and says, may I take a loan? And his employers say, no, we're done with loans. Why do you need 3,000, 4,000 rand to go to a funeral? And Johannes never gets to bury his father. The reason, or the moment of violence, was not Johannes' death. The moment of the violence was the moment Johannes was conceived. Why is this? Because from the moment of conception for 1,000 days, the nutrition that you ingest determines your well-being, your capability, your ability to achieve in life intellectually and physically for the rest of your life. 1,000 days worth of nutrition. If your nutrition is good, is diverse, is rich, chances are you're going to succeed in life. If you are denied rich nutrition, you will be starting from further back at the launch of the race. And so a person who lives in poverty sets up, or has set up for them, a barrier from the moment of conception. Bearing in mind that most people who live in poverty can't afford school fees, the chances are education won't be complete. And the chances are you'll have to go into a job at a mining community or as a gardener. And the chances are you will have insufficient money to save, possibly to even send a child to school, with the result that the next generation is born with minimal nutrition, minimal education, minimal capacity to achieve in life, and minimal capacity to survive. That cycle is the cycle of poverty. That cycle is itself an act of violence. That is a violence that we can't see, and it's invisible. We don't see Johannes lying on his deathbed, by the way, being treated by his wife. The majority of mine-affected or miners who return home to the sending communities from which they hail are looked after by women in those communities. Those women are subsidizing the mining companies who are supposed to be responsible for the health of their miners. It's a fascinating concept, that aside. The system of poverty is designed to be entrenched. And it's not a mistake. Poverty is and was created as a result of apartheid, but also as a result of international trade, international law principles, international economic law. So, for example, in the United States, they have a system of subsidies. What does that mean? It means that for every bale of cotton you produce as a farmer, the government will subsidize you. If it costs $1 to create that bale, the government will give you $1. So if you sell at $1.50, you've made a 50% profit. Contrast to, say, Ghana. There, a bale of cotton costs maybe 50 cents to make and to create. And cotton is the key industry in Ghana. A bad cotton yield, and you're left with a real need to sell as much as possible. The problem is that the United States has a trade agreement with Ghana, which it entered into, contrary to the human rights imperatives of Ghana, on the basis that it would be able to import at any price. It then imports at $1.10. It makes a 10 cents profit off the captured market. The rest of the cotton farmers in Ghana enter into a state of complete impoverishment. The economy collapses, and the Ghanaian government then has to turn to the World Bank to take out a loan. And the World Bank says, yes, we'll give you this loan on the condition that you move from sustaining small-scale farming to large-scale farming, and by the way, you may not subsidize it. And these are cycles of poverty, and that is the first invisible manifestation of poverty that we need to consider as a component of violence. The second story is about a man named Pat. One night, Pat was sitting in his house on a farm. He owned this farm. And it was in Rustenburg. And Pat was sitting, having had a few drinks, quietly, slowly falling to sleep on his couch when two men came into the house, strangled him, killed him, put him into the boot of his car and drove away, disposed of the body. They were eventually captured and tried and given 2 life sentences. But this is not the beginning of the story. This is the end of the story. The story started about 30 years before, when a woman by the name of Ferreira was born into a family in which she suffered terrible emotional and psychological abuse by her family and was abandoned at the age of 16, left to look after herself. She married young and had 3 children. Her partner, her husband, was extremely abusive and she eventually left the marriage. She had no source of income, she had no educational training, and so she put her children into foster care on the basis that that was the best thing for them. Incredibly brave, incredibly sorrowful decision to make. She then pursued job after job, all menial, until eventually she found a job on a farm as a housekeeper in the home of Pat. After about 3 months, Pat declared his love for Ferreira. And they began a romantic relationship. She moved out of the quarters, the staff quarters, and into his bed. Over time, however, the relationship started to deteriorate. Pat began to insult her, tell her that she was a poor white, that she was incapable of looking after her children, and was a bad mother for abandoning her children to foster care. He told her that she was stupid, incapable, and wasn't even able to clean properly anymore, and therefore he would stop paying her. But she had to continue cleaning because she was financially dependent on him. One day, Ferreira was at home making a cup of tea. Pat came home from the fields and said to her, "Give me a drink." And she said, "Give me 1 moment, I'm making a cup of tea." The next thing she knew, she was lying on the floor with a broken nose. He had beaten her. "Don't do that again," he said. Following this was a wave of ever-increasing, ever-severe violence, physical violence. She suffered all manner of violence. She had broken bones, bleeding internally. He used to throttle her while they were intimate. And on one occasion, she had to have surgery done to her phalanx because it had been so damaged. Every time they went to the doctor, when he allowed it, for the most part he denied her medical attention, she was not allowed to speak. She was not allowed to tell them what had happened. But also, nobody asked. On 3 occasions, she called the police. They only came on 1 occasion, and when they did, they simply said to her, "He's drunk. Just wait until he sobers up and everything will be fine." And then one day, Pat came home at the end of the day and said to her, "Come outside." She was terrified of him at this stage, terrified. He had made her lose contact with her children, with her family, with any friends she had. She was utterly alone. And he said to her, "Come outside." And she went outside, and standing in a line in front of the house were 14 laborers. And he turned to her and said, "Strip and show these men your genitals." The men turned their back. They refused to participate. They refused to watch. And they turned their backs and dispersed. In a rage and a fury, Pat grabbed Ferreira, pulled her inside, and brutally raped her. He then said to her, "If you ever leave me, I will find you." And she knew it was the truth because she had left 3 times before, and each time he had found her. And he said, "If you ever leave me, or if you ever go to the authorities, I will arrange for you to be gang raped." And she knew it was possible. So she was sitting in a situation in which she knew she was going to be raped by him again, or she was going to be raped by somebody else, or a combination. She could neither stay nor leave. Her choices were limited to killing herself or killing Pat. And so she hired 2 men to go into Pat's home and kill him. forever received a life sentence. And in appealing that sentence, the Supreme Court of Appeal recognized that she was trapped. They recognized that her psychosis at the time, her psychological position at the time, was one of self-defense. But we don't understand self-defense in that way, do we? We understand self-defense as, I'm going to hold up my arm against the knife that is coming towards me, and I'm going to, that the defense of act of violence must be imminent, must be about to happen. But here she had waited 2 weeks from that incident before arranging murder. And the judges of the Supreme Court of Appeal said, yes, it was premeditated, but in her mind, it was imminent. She knew she had no other option. Every day she waited, she knew she may be killed. And the Supreme Court then said, well, we can't extinguish the finding of guilt. At this stage, she had spent 3 years in jail, but what we can do is reduce the sentence to 6 years, 3 of which are suspended. In other words, you can walk free now. In a dissenting judgment, the judge categorically disagreed with this. He said she could have left at any stage, she could have sought help, but you cannot allow someone to commit premeditated murder, and I will give her 8 years. But that's not the point. The point is one of the highest justices of the country was blind and deaf to the invisible violence that characterized this case. But where does this violence come from? Where does gender-based violence originate from? It originates from a notion of inferiority on the part of women. We see it in the same way with race. These are notions of one entity being inferior to another. And it starts in the most insidious, benign ways in which we raise our children. Don't throw like a girl, right? As if there's something wrong with being a girl. Anyone who saw the soccer World Cup, the Women's Soccer World Cup, will know that there is, that the sports personship, the capability of women in sports is singularly profound. The soccer players earned half of the male soccer players, notwithstanding that they had won 3 Olympic gold medals and were the top team in the world, whereas the male soccer team had never won a single gold medal, never even made it into the Olympics. But, said the soccer authorities in the United States, the men draw a bigger crowd. Well, actually, that's not the case. The women's soccer final actually drew more people watching, viewers, than any other sporting event, more so than the NBA. But there was this belief that women's soccer is inferior. There is a belief that inferiority allows for and justifies a treatment of a person in a violent way because they're inferior. This is a cycle of violence. It's invisible often. We don't see it. But the result is an act of overt violence, the type of violence that we see in criminal statistics. Interestingly, women who kill their intimate partners, on average, will receive about 15 years imprisonment for that crime. Men who kill their intimate partners, on average, 2 to 5 years for that crime. The evidence is bountiful. There is a low-level civil war being conducted against women, exacerbated by alternative fault lines of discrimination, race, poverty, geography. But this form of violence is something that seeps into our everyday lives. The next story that I'd like to tell you is a story about a chicken. Actually, it's about 90 billion chickens. 90 billion chickens killed every year in the food industry. That excludes the egg-laying hens and the roosters, right? 90 billion. So that works out to roughly 100,000 chickens a second slaughtered for the consumption of meat. But that's not even the bad part. That's not the bad part. The bad part is how they live. So from the moment that their egg is hatched, the chickens are diverted into what we call battery cages. The battery cages cram full of chickens, full of chickens. And these chickens become paralyzed, overweight. They are injected with antibiotics, with weight enhancers so that they grow as big as possible. Turkeys, by the way, no longer look like the original turkey. And this artificial development of the chicken means that they start to fight each other. So in order to avoid chickens pecking at each other and then destroying the fabric of the meat and the value of the meat, they debeak the chick. After it is born, they take a laser and they slice off the beak with no anesthetic. The chicken then experiences a lifetime of imprisonment, never sees the sun, never knows earth, is fed a combination of foods, many of which come from other animals. It's forced into cannibalism. Many die, they live in squalor, and eventually they're shipped off for slaughter. How are they slaughtered? Well, they are hung up by their legs, throats are slit, and then thrust into boiling water to get the feathers off, and sometimes the throat isn't slit. Now this is a horror. This is a horror. But it's a horror that is wrapped up in cling wrap and plastic and put on the shelves of Woolworths and Pick n Pay and Checkers. But this meat industry, this farming industry, includes not only chickens. 1.5 billion pigs are slaughtered every year. I doubt there are many people in this audience who are going to consume it. But the reality is there's the same level of cruelty. Female pigs are contained in sow cages. As soon as they are pregnant, they're taken into this cage that gives them just enough space on either side and in front to sit up, but to stand or to lie down. They cannot move sideways. They cannot move backwards. And they are kept there for the duration of their pregnancy. Just before they're about to give birth, they moved into another cage, a farrowing cage. And in that farrowing cage, pretty much the same size, but there's just a slightly bigger area for the piglets to be safe from the pig collapsing on it. Because they found that too many pigs were dying from their mother collapsing in exhaustion onto the piglets, right? So, also, the problem with these sow cages is that a lot of the pigs would start biting each other's tails. They bite on the steel bars. It's the most incredible manifestation of psychological harm. And so what they do is they take the tails off. Same story. Split the tails off, and without anesthetic. The stories go on and on and on. But this is not the only part of the violence that's invisible. Because the mass consumption of meat is one of the leading contributors both to environmental degradation and to food insecurity in the world. 1/3 of the land, the farmed land worldwide, is used for the production of grain that is fed to meat, that is fed for the production of meat, fed to animals. So the percentage of that land's fruit, of the food that comes out of that land, is actually diverted to the tiniest percentage of meat, well, not the tiniest percentage, but the percentage of the value of that nutritional availability goes to the meat eaters, creating an ultimate shortage of food. And food shortage and water shortage are two of the fundamental bases for war and conflict. So we see how another form of violence, in and of itself horrific. No one here, I'm sure, is satisfied with the idea that a sentient animal can go through that kind of trauma. But the violence becomes public. And in all three stories, we can see how that which is invisible to us, that which we don't see, or that which we choose not to see, has an impact on violence that we do see. They are inextricably linked. But what does one do with invisible violence? How do we respond to invisible violence? Well, Jose Saramago, the Nobel Prize-winning author, if you haven't read any of his work, I strongly urge you to do so. And the work that I love the most is a book called Blindness. It's an amazing story. And it begins with a man driving his car, and he's at the robot, and all of a sudden, everything goes white. And this affliction spreads across the country. Everybody goes blind, but they don't see black, they see white. And the story is about how the country deals with those who are afflicted, and what happens to those who are afflicted when they are cast out of society. And there's a quote from that book that I believe is a guide to us. The quote says, "I think we are blind but seeing. Blind people who can see but do not see." And that blindness and that failure to see is the precise mechanism required for the continuation of invisible violence. The only way that we can respond to these forms of violence is in structural change. And that doesn't mean that everybody now has to go out and be a vegan, which would be nice, and I would encourage, or a vegetarian. But it does mean that we can stop purchasing meat from large-scale retailers to show them that the consumption that drives this industry is in fact a consumption that can be curtailed. And if that consumption is curtailed, well, this is the ultimate principle of capitalism, right? If there are no purchasers, if there is no profit to be made, things will change. Now, I'm not suggesting that consumer behavior is the be-all and end-all to the massacre of animals. I am suggesting, however, that we have alternative ways of reconstructing the reality and envisaging an alternative reality, envisaging and imagining a reality that is different from the one we experience. Not simply to cradle our hearts and our heads in despair, but to identify, even in the minuscule manner, a way in which we can respond to this violence and stop this violence or impede it. How can we do that in respect of poverty? We can start thinking very seriously about how we pay the people who look after our children. A legacy of apartheid is this cruel notion that if you provide somebody with accommodation and access to food in your kitchen, that somehow that's good enough and you can pay a few $1,000 for them, and you may even pay UIF for that person. Now bear in mind that that person, the child care, the caregiver, is doing one of the most important jobs in the world, looking after the most important people in our lives. And we're paying indigent salaries. As a community, is that acceptable? Should we not be paying salaries that are commensurate with the value being given? Are we happy to accept that simply because a person doesn't have an education, that their value and their contribution to society is any less valuable? Bearing in mind that the salary we pay is not for the purposes of one person. In this country, the salary that is paid to one person is used by 10. What is our role in perpetuating that? By the way, the people who are paid the poorest in this country, who are paid the least, I should say, nurses, teachers, and police. What are our biggest crises in this country? Health, education, and crime. And we have to really revisit and review and understand why it is that we value or attribute value to a CEO paying inconceivable amounts of money, but the person who puts our child to sleep, who ensures that they wake up healthy, receives an indigent salary. And what a Ferreira. There is one basic step that each one of us can take, and that's to believe. If a person comes to you and says, I've been hurt, believe them. Don't say, but your husband's such a great guy. He would never do that. Or don't say, but what were you wearing? Why were you out late tonight? Don't say, I don't want to hear about it. It's best to forget about it. Just believe a person. Because in the 20-odd years of work that I've been doing on this, the most crippling moment for survivors is when the person in whom they trust says, no, I don't believe you, or no, do not take this further. And I think I've given you enough horror stories tonight. There are many more. The role that we can play, though, is talking. Believe when you hear it. Talk about it. Because it is not our shame. The shame is not on the victim, although the shame is felt by the victim. The shame is on the perpetrator. We can tell our children that the fact that you are born with male genitalia or female genitalia or a combination, or the fact that you are born in a body with which you do not associate a gender, does not mean that you are destined for a life of victimization. Does not mean that you are allowed to be a perpetrator of violence. And we can tell our children, run like a girl, throw like a girl, run like a boy, throw like a boy, and inject in our children a notion of positivity about who they are, their individuality. And to say to a 5-6-year-old child, not do you have a girlfriend if they're a boy, or a boyfriend if they're a girl, but you can say, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or a close friend? I once said to a member of my family, my nephew who was about 12 at the time, do you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend? And the family went silent. And they ripped into me. How dare you allude to the fact that he might be gay? Apart from the fact that I was simply saying, which, it's okay if you have either, this is a safe space in which to discuss it. Their take-home point was there had been an untold insult. Let us move away from this violence, and we can do it moment by moment, without feeling the terror and the anxiety, without carrying in our hearts the pain, because we don't need to do that, because it doesn't help. But carry in our hearts the certainty that we can be the agents of change, and we are the agents of change. And by being the agents of change, we can no longer afford to be blind. We have to see. And in seeing them, whatever way in which we can, in our world and in our life, take those steps to break that cycle of violence.
Within the university standard, there's been a lot of violence that's going on with gender-based violence. And I think that as much as we speak about the gender-based violence of females, males towards females, I feel as though there's also not a lot of topic of the other way, vice versa. Because the thing is, when we talk about gender-based violence, we're just talking about gender as a whole, not just talking about female or male or female. So my question is, should there not be also a topic of that, as much as it is not as big, but it is something that has been not acknowledged or isolated within the university standard? And as you said, you're working with gender-based violence, what can we move forward to bring in that topic of saying that, look, when we talk about gender-based violence, and specifically the word gender, we are also asking the males to come forward against violence against themselves.
Thank you for the opportunity. I just want to find out from you, since you're working on this gender-based violence, because you find that when you talk about gender-based violence, men think that they treat their wives, mothers, So it seems like we went backward to the time when Patrick began. We're not really succeeding in this war. And it seems it might not happen in this generation, but maybe third, second generation from now, because we're not rigorously addressing it.
My one question is that very often we have groups where we meet and we talk about gender-based violence, and we speak about feminism, we speak about veganism, we speak about all these things, but what are the tangible things that we can do to get involved? Because very often we're preaching to the choir, we're preaching to the converted, but what are communities or other ways that we can get involved and make the biggest impact?
The question about gender-based violence by women against men and within the university context. And I'm so glad you asked it because it raises a number of answers that bother me a lot. One of the reasons why there isn't an emphasis on female violence against men is partly because of the stigma around masculinity and the notion that being hurt by a girl, beaten by a girl, is something to be ashamed of. But that's one of the reasons why it's underreported. But the other reason why there isn't as much of a focus on that and a discussion around that is because the phenomenon of gender-based violence is different from other violence in general because it's moored in gender-based discrimination. That is the seed from which the violence grows. And so the focus on gender-based violence is because it is part of the structure of gender-based discrimination. Now, I don't think that is a satisfactory answer for not discussing the inverse forms of violence. I think it's also important to have a much deeper conversation and much more open conversation about violence within same-sex relationships. That's hugely invisibilized, partly because a lot of people still don't want to talk about their sexual orientation or want to say that they're in a same-sex partnership. And even if you're in a heterosexual partnership, you don't want to talk about violence. So here there's a double layer of silencing. I think we need to have very serious conversations around that. But the reason why I think the focus still has to be on violence by men against women is because it is so profoundly present. If you think about the Rhodes movement and the naming of perpetrators, the hundreds and thousands of perpetrators who have raped, abused, hurt, harassed women students on all campuses, but particularly on Rhodes. Out of that whole process, you know who was expelled and taken to court? 2 women, 2 survivors, for apparently punching someone. And it's not even clear that they did it, but they're the ones who have been excluded from university for life. They're the ones that are receiving the wrath of all the vice-chancellors, Wits included. And we have to question, how systemic is this? Which brings me to your question, that of despair. Are we going backwards? And my answer categorically is no, we are not going backwards. In fact, the reason that we know so much today is because we're going forwards. It's not necessarily that gender-based violence is increasing. It may be. My view is that we're hearing more about it. The veil is starting to come away. Look at the #MeToo movement. It is unbelievable. Those of you who haven't listened to the testimonies of the world's famous actresses talking about Harvey Weinstein, go and see it. Go and see the power. We're talking about it here. Look at the protests that we had. Look at what our government has said about it. Look at what the president has said about it. And look how angry women are about it. Has that stopped? Or will it stop the violence in our generation? I don't know. I don't think violence will ever stop. When I was writing my book, I went through a terrible moment for about a month where I thought, what am I doing? Violence by men against women is as old as history itself. And it will continue forever. But what we can change, and you mentioned this, what we can change is the way we respond to that violence. Do we allow it to be invisible? Do we shun it? Do we worry ourselves only with the violence perpetrated in public, or do we worry ourselves equally with the violence perpetrated in private? And I think we're starting to do that. I think, and I believe, and I see it, in 20 years, there has been a marked shift. And so I never for one moment believe in the failure of this project, not at all. Oh, there was another question about getting involved. What do you do? Sorry, where are you? There you are. Part of me wants to say, just carry on doing what you're doing. No. Let me challenge you on that, this question of it's not enough. That worries me. Because the reality is that if you say it's not enough, you've got to do more. And a person feels, well, I can't do that. Then you stop doing anything at all. And one doesn't need to fight a battle with the same weaponry. As many different people as, and I use the analogy very deliberately. I use that. I do not think Ferreira's act of violence was violence. I would argue that it is not. It's survival. She was fighting in the war. But my point is, you need a variety of different approaches. Holding groups and reading circles and engaging with each other on the subject. One day someone walks into that discussion who's either experienced violence or who never knew about it, and goes away and talks to her family about it or his family about it. What can you do about the question of food? Especially in our religion, which is so fastidiously dedicated to the eating of meat. It's entrenched in our traditions, in our holidays, in our festivals. We can expose the falsehood around that. The highest moment of spirituality in the Jewish people was when they were wandering in the desert and they ate manna. They were vegetarians, vegans. Jesus Christ, the highest moment of spirituality was when his 40 days, where he ate no meat. There's nothing discordant with rejecting the eating of meat in our age. Nothing. And especially in this shul, I mean, there's been the most amazing, and David and you've been at the heart of this, the most amazing alternatives. You know, we now have the Paschal parsnip on our Pesach table. You know, and I think that there is a power in all of us in having these conversations, in asking our teenage children, are you interested in boys or girls? Do you know yet? Because it's, you know, the same as asking, is there anyone that you really like at school? Because it shouldn't be an issue, right? We shouldn't hope for our children to be of one sexual orientation or another. We should hope for our children to be happy, and that's the first step in that direction. But if you feel that you want to do more, that you personally want to do more, taking up a cause in your universities, in your schools, in your workplaces, bringing in speakers, because ultimately it's the transmission of ideas. Right? Think of all the major genocides. Think of all of those genocides were premised on the transmission of ideas. The inverse is true. The transmission of ideas, the transmission of information, is the ultimate cure to the invisibility of the violence. So keep on what you do.
I'd like to ask you two questions from two different scenarios. Have you got a view on why levels of aggression and violence in South Africa seem to be so much higher than elsewhere? And I'd be interested in your view of the impact of systematic violence in the Middle East.
I'm a little disappointed in the stories that you told us, because to me they are invisible violence that manifests themselves ultimately in physical violence. Visible. Invisible that manifests invisible. And in my experience, there's much more of invisible violence that doesn't necessarily manifest itself in visible violence. And I think that's the violence that's the most frightening in many ways. It's the least obvious, it's the most pervasive, and it's the one that we live with almost every day of our lives. And so I appreciated your examples, but I think that they veil something much more pervasive than that. And you made a plea to just believe the woman. And when we say, what can we do, and we start to give examples of very complex things that we can do, and you kept using the word systemic things that we can do, and yet I just want to ask, why don't we believe the woman? That's just the most simple thing we can do. Why don't we just believe the woman? Forget about multi-million rand interventions. Forget about complex networks of support groups. Why don't we just do the most simple thing and believe what the woman said? I don't think that there's a single woman sitting here in this room who doesn't experience daily violence in their interactions. And that doesn't mean a slap across the face or a punch in the stomach. That means humiliation, expectation of inferiority, expectation of managing a situation, tolerating a language and a behavior that's intolerable. And I doubt if there's a single woman in this room who doesn't know what I'm talking about. And that's the pervasive violence I'm talking about.
Even here in South Africa, at workplace, we suffer. At places of worship, we suffer. Men are so dominating, and they don't care. And the UN is not even addressing this article, because women are still suffering. Women are still raped. I can tell you stories in my workplace where you have a man competing with a woman. So you can't take this position because you're a woman. And you get so much abuse.
The high levels of violence in South Africa, there are a lot of theories around it. My point, in fact, was that, and I think this came up in one or two other questions, is that invisible violence and visible violence ultimately are linked, and that the one leads to the other. So I'll come to I think, your very powerful intervention in the moment. And one of the reasons for the high rates of violence in South Africa is because of apartheid. Now, some people say, well, you can't blame everything on apartheid always, but I'm afraid you can and must. Why is this? Because we haven't transitioned out of it. We actually haven't. You know, politically, yes, we have the ability to vote and to participate in the governance of the country, irrespective of our race and sex, correct. Economically, there has been no shift. If anything, black people in South Africa have got poorer and white people have got richer. And what drives a lot of the violence in the country is the combination of dissatisfaction, desperate poverty, ill health, and a lack of a future. I'm not saying that this justifies violence, not at all. And there are people who are desperately ill and desperately poor and desperately disenfranchised who don't commit violence. So my explanation is not a justification. But I think our history has a lot to do with it. I think that we also are not that different from countries all over the world. I think that, of course, we have these incredibly high levels of violence, but we're also the most unequal country in the world. And inequality, poverty, another form of violence, and that is a system. And if you are in an equal society, the violence just manifests differently. I did a study of Nicaragua, Mexico, and Sweden, of the extent of domestic violence in those three countries. And the instances, proportionately, of domestic violence is exactly the same across all three countries. So I don't believe that there's something essential and decentralized about this country that makes it violent. But the second reason why I think that we have such high levels of violence and such prominent levels of violence is because of a complete lack of impunity. or complete impunity, a complete lack of accountability. So if you look at some of the judgments that come out of our courts, if those cases even get to court, sentences are weak, the judicial system, the police, there is a terrible sense of injustice. And in the face of the injustice and in the face of impunity, you get endorsement. You get the naturalization. If you look at the Cape Flats and the levels of violence there, it's a way of life. It's the same as the favelas in Brazil, inner city communities in the United States. Because if you are trapped in a cycle of poverty, and if you are trapped in a particular context, where your choice, as by the way was the case in many cities in New Haven, in the United States I visited, including the one in which I lived, where you have two worlds side by side, and the one world is black and the other world is white in the United States. And the black world is poor, and you've got two choices, at least in New Haven, where Yale is situated, you've got two choices. You either serve food in a dining hall to mostly white kids, university kids, or you go into drugs. Those are your choices. So I think that's part of the reason for the high levels of violence in this country, and that's certainly been my life's pursuit, is to change these systems. And the Middle East, there's some theories that suggest that victims of genocide in generations to come will commit genocide. That's certainly been the pattern of the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. And I certainly don't buy into the notion that that's correct. I'm giving you a source of one explanation. But the other explanation, if you look at any war throughout the ages, what drives it? What drives war? Three things: religion or ideology, land, and national pride. This is the basis of war. The Greek war, it's about wealth and ideology predominantly. The conflicts in the Middle East are because every single entity in the Middle East has gone through several generations of knowing only violence. And carrying the violence of the Holocaust and the pogroms into a new city, into a new state rather, means inevitably that there's going to be a violence. So I don't know that this is a sufficient explanation, and it's certainly one I'll give more thought. But I do think that that's probably one of the most latent examples of how violence perpetuates violence. I really found, I'm sorry, is it Leslie? Leslie, I really appreciate what you said, and I'm quite moved. I think, I agree with you that, and it's in fact what I was trying to say, that the most pervasive violence is that which we don't see. But my only differentiating point is that it then results often in the visible violence. I think the way you articulate it is I can only defer to it. I think you're absolutely right. And it's precisely that invisibilization that every woman in this room is nodding their head. Right? And if it's not them, then it's someone else. Right? 1 in 3 women. 1 in 3 women sitting in this room has been raped. So, and it is, I agree with you wholeheartedly, the invisible. And the stories that I told were designed to show that ultimately. But thank you for what you said. Why don't we believe women? So, up until 1980, 1983 I think it was, there was a rule in our law of evidence in this country that was called the cautionary rule. It still exists, but the cautionary rule says that you have to take evidence from certain people in a case with caution. You have to treat it with caution. So, for example, the evidence of a police officer has to be treated with some caution. because the police officer will have an interest in the outcome of the case. Kind of makes sense, right? You have to treat the evidence of a child with caution, because a child doesn't have the maturity to necessarily understand and translate what has happened. I think there's a debate to be had around that, but it has at least some objective sense. Up until 1983, the cautionary rule, included anyone who made a claim, any woman making a claim of sexual violence. That woman making a claim of sexual violence had to be treated with caution. Today we say it's the single witness issue, right? If you're a single witness, you've got to treat that with caution because there's no corroborating evidence. But at the time, it was simply because you were laying a charge of sexual assault. And why was this? And if you go back and look at the case law, it's staggering. Judges saying things like, women are wont to lie. They do it in order to get vengeance. And you hear that narrative today, I hear it all the time. You hear it now, that there are movements within workplaces. All she has to do is say that I assaulted her in my name and reputation will ruin for life. Yeah, well, I've been doing this for 20 years and I've not once come across a false claim. In fact, the number of false claims that have ever been made are infinitesimal. And yet that's what we focus on, right? The falseness. Because we still inherently believe that women lie. And that's what this jurisprudence, these cases actually say. They say women are wont to lie. Women will use this in order to get revenge from a jilted lover. Or they'll say they've been raped because when they've had an affair and get pregnant, they don't want their family to be angry with them, and so they turn around and rape. And therefore you must treat that with caution. Now this may have changed on the statute books, but I guarantee you it has not changed in the courts. 6% of rapes are reported. Of those 6%, only 6% actually go to court. And then the conviction is very, very low conviction rates. And when there is a conviction, the conviction and the sentencing are often radically disproportionate to the harm that had occurred. I don't know those of you who listen to 702, there was a discussion on the radio this afternoon, I was in a discussion with Joanne, about a magistrate whose entire caseload dealing with sexual violence is under review. It's been audited for improper sentencing. You know, that's why I'm going to continue to disagree. I'm going to fight with you on this. And I do it with respect, because you probably know far better than I do. And I really do that with respect. But I then also have an obligation to bear the brunt of both. And yeah, so I think that's right. People don't know how serious it is. But after tonight, there are 40 odd people who do. And that 40 odd people, you know, you're the ambassadors of change. And that's fine. I also think that women aren't believed because it's very difficult to believe in cruelty. I remember when I first came back to South Africa in 2010, I had a case come to me of 20 learners in matric who had been raped by their science teacher, otherwise they were failed. So it was, we call it STM, sexually transmitted marks. And it's a thing, it's a total thing. And I wasn't practicing at the time, I was just an academic. But I went to practitioners and I said to them, why don't you take on this case? And they said, well, it's not possible, they must be lying. It's not possible that a teacher would do this. And at first I was like, devastated, distraught that somebody would. And then I realized, actually, part of it, yes, is sexist, but part of it was also a hopefulness in the good of humanity. And we have to see the seriousness of it, and seeing the seriousness of it exposes us to a degradation of the soul that is almost impossible to recover from. But it is possible to recover from that.
Bonnie, very warmly for an extraordinarily impressive and insightful address.
thinking about it, I'd like to start with something that W.H. Auden, the British poet, wrote in anticipation of the Second World War, watching events unfolding, German invasion of Poland imminent. And he wrote, "And the public should know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done, do evil in return." So Auden's very negative sense of that situation was an almost inevitable cyclicity of violence. You do evil and it precipitates evil in return. But I think the question of violence, as you've brought it out this evening, is actually far more complex and far more profound. What you were calling invisible violence, I think many philosophers would call, thanks Jess, would call structural violence, violence that lies within social and political and cultural systems, and of course violence also that lies in gender relationships. And this is the kind of violence that I meet every day when I go to work, working in the same place as you do, and as many members of this audience happen to work too at Wits University. And you see that violence, I think, in the inevitable differences between our students. Those who have everything and those who have nothing. Students who sit in the class and sidle up to you afterwards and ask how they can get help because they're hungry, because they have nowhere to sleep. Those who are sleeping in the libraries, those who are washing in the toilets and the other student facilities. And of course this kind of violence, the violence that more generically we associate with Fanon's wretched of the earth, is also the violence that takes on the very aggressive, overt forms that Bonnie began with. The forms which lead to student protest and student destructiveness, the events we saw in 2015 and 2016, including buses set on fire on our campus and libraries burning. And for me, one of the key conundrums of that period, of the libraries burning, was a form of invisible violence that is deeply related to deprivation of education. A colleague said to me that he had sent a senior group to the library to research what he saw as a fairly simple assignment. And some of his students from disadvantaged backgrounds returned and said, "You gave us an impossible task. How do you expect us to do this with what we know?" And so the library becomes not a place of resource, a place of fulfillment of knowledge, but a place of shame and a place of alienation. And it seems to me that that is, in my little microcosm, another expression of the invisible violence you were talking about. And in gender terms, it's instructive to watch Rahad Desai's film about Fees Must Fall, in which one of the male student leaders says of the women, "But when nothing else is left, at least we've got patriarchy." And that, of course, again justifies certain kinds of violence that Bonnie has spoken about in very great detail, and I think with enormous sensitivity and perception. So how does this touch us? I'm not sure. Bonnie suggests we can make a difference. I'm a little more cautious, perhaps. I think we should certainly try. In our tradition as Jews, of course, and particularly as progressive Jews who come from a strongly prophetic background, the message is clear. Amos warns us against those who sell the poor for the price of a pair of shoes. Isaiah reminds us that our prayers don't do much good if we deal unjustly and injure other people. In fact, he refers to striking out with a savage fist. So in a sense, Judaism has always pointed us in that direction, and social justice seems to me inevitably to go hand in hand with being Jewish, and to go hand in hand also with a certain kind of messianism. There's the notion that even if you don't believe in the coming of the Messiah. And in a progressive community, it's safe to say that an awful lot of us don't. Nonetheless, you ought to behave as though you did. And it's that kind of messianism that finds its expression, I think, in some quite important social and political movements. I'm thinking of Marx. Remember, Papa Marx was a Jew. I'm thinking of Walter Benjamin, a socialist, but also a Jew. And finally, I'm thinking of Jacques Derrida, who critiqued both Marx and Benjamin, but said that we should always look to a future yet to come, a future that is probably impossible and unrealizable. But one of the core characteristics of that future yet to come would be restitutive justice, and that you could not recognize it as the future yet to come unless it brought that restitutive justice with it. So that's perhaps a more abstract and typically academic way of approaching what you've been saying so vividly and so concretely tonight. But we'd like to thank you very warmly again, Bonnie, for coming, for being with us the second time at Beit Emanuel. Bonnie addressed us very powerfully at our Human Rights Shabbat. When was it, a year or two ago? So on behalf of the congregation, we would like to offer you a very small gift, a copy of Mishkan Tefillah, which is our daily prayer book. And please, carry on with your work. Carry on resisting violence wherever you find it. And I think you'll find that most of the members of Beit Emanuel will be there right behind you.